Good evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Jesse Harrista, who is an assistant professor of social sciences and the director of the International Studies program at Cazenovia College. He has taught the college's senior seminar on human rights and genocide for the past 6 years and has participated yearly in the Frontiers of Prevention Convention, organized by the Institute for Mass Atrocity and Genocide Prevention at Binghamton University. In 2019, he was invited to give a workshop on classroom strategies of teaching genocide prevention for a global audience at the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities in New York City. Outside of his work on genocide prevention, his research interests surround the use, promotion, and revitalization of lesser used and heritage languages. Jesse's co-edited book entitled Metalinguistic Communities, Case Studies of Agency, Ideology, and Symbolic Uses of Language is due to be published by Palgrave Macmillan in October. His presentation tonight is titled Raphael Lemkin and the Invention of Genocide.
Thanks, Bill. It's good to see all you folks here today, including some familiar faces and names, a couple of my students here, which is always great. So I'm gonna share my screen if you just give me a moment to get this going. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, everyone, and to be speaking for the two libraries. I love the chance to be able to talk on a really important topic for a public audience, and hopefully we'll get some chance for questions at the end. So today I'm going to be talking about a figure who's not particularly well known, but whose ideas are really important and really useful, and that's Raphael Lemkin. So and my plan today is to talk about his ideas, but also talk about how they've been applied and reapplied in multiple different contexts in the years since they were created. So to start off with, I always ask my students this question, what is genocide? And the typical answers that I get from my students is that they tend to associate genocide. Either they don't really have a very good sense of what it is. They sort of know that it's bad and that it involves lots of people dying. And they typically can come up with the example of the Holocaust, and perhaps, different years, students, sometimes they've talked a little bit about the Sudan and Darfur crisis, or the Rohingya crisis in Bangladesh and Myanmar recently, but they tend not to have a very good handle on the concept. And this is unfortunate, because I believe that this is an incredibly important topic for our contemporary world, one which we continue to need to engage with constantly, unfortunately. And we typically, when we think of genocide, we tend to think of mass death. And sometimes people refer to any large event of mass death as a genocide. And I think that this, while understandable, is unfortunate and doesn't do justice to the importance and power of the concept of genocide, which, as we'll get to, Raphael Lemkin first created for us. And one of the important things here is that we tend to have a concept of genocide which misses the fact that not all genocides involve killing on a large scale. Not all genocides involve a lot of people who can be targeted. Some groups are small. Sometimes the genocidaires are not successful, but the crime is still there. And also, not all large acts of killing are acts of genocide. And so, what is genocide then, and how do we understand it? Well, let's start with the concept, the word itself, right? Which was given to us first in 1947 by Raphael Lemkin. And it comes from two Greek roots, genos, which means race or tribe, and is also the origin of the word genetics, and cide, which is killing, which you're probably familiar with, right? So homicide is the killing of a person, or regicide is the killing of a king. And it was this man, Raphael Lemkin, who first coined this term. It's one of these terms which seems like it could have been around for a long time, but it's actually within living memory that this word was invented. So Mr. Lemkin was born in 1900 and lived until 1959. He was born in Poland, though I believe in the Tsarist Empire originally, and then the Republic of Poland. He was Jewish, and he was a lawyer. And after 1941, he moved to the United States, where he lived the rest of his life. At the outset of World War I, despite being 40 at the time, or sorry, 39, He volunteered for the Polish army and was wounded, and because of that was withdrawn from the front lines, and that's probably the reason he survived the war. Unfortunately, for him, like so many Jewish families, his family was devastated by the Holocaust. He was one of the only survivors of his particular family, and um, Lemkin Lemkin wanted to use his skills as a lawyer in order to try and understand the crimes of the Nazi regime. He wanted to understand why they occurred and how they occurred through sort of a surgical precision, breaking down the pieces and the stages of these crimes. He originally wanted to refer to it as the crime of barbarity, but eventually changed and decided to create a new term for it, one that was more specific to the processes that he saw going on, which he came up with as genocide. And in his final years, he did teach at Yale and Rutgers law schools and lived in New Jersey. And so the origin of the term here, now I said 1947 earlier, that was my mistake, 1945. He publishes a book entitled Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. And he said in this, and this is the first time the term ever gets used. He says, generally speaking, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation. It is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups, with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. And this is very important because Lemkin tells us that the crime of genocide is directed not necessarily at the persons in question, but at the group in question. And so the goal is the annihilation of a group. And there are various strategies which may or may not involve killing for the annihilation of peoples. And so he directs us to this point that the crime of genocide is a crime directed against the collective rather than an individual, though it will, of course, necessarily involve many smaller crimes, many crimes within the overall umbrella that are directed at particular individuals. He continues here that genocide has two phases. One, destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group, and the other, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. This imposition, in turn, may be made upon the oppressed population, which is allowed to remain, or upon the territory alone, after the removal of the population and the colonization of the area by the oppressor's own nationals. And this is important because it's oftentimes this two-stage element is oftentimes overlooked in our understanding of genocide. The goal of genocide is the replacement of one people by another people. And this involves not simply destruction, but also imposition on top of it. One of the survivors of the Rwandan genocide once wrote that genocide is, after all, a community building activity. And while perverse, it is absolutely true that the goal of genocide is not simply annihilation, is never simply annihilation. It is absorption, imposition, and replacement. And so the Nazis aimed to replace the Jewish population or the Polish population or any of the other populations of whose lands they conquered, annexed, and whose peoples they wished to annihilate. And so we need to always be aware of this sort of two-step process and to ask who benefits from these things and who is the people whose national patterns have been imposed upon the lands that have been conquered, where the peoples have been removed. Now, to understand how Lemkin came to these concepts and to this revolutionary idea of genocide, it's important for us to understand a little bit of the background of this and how Lemkin himself is working in a tradition that is older than him, that is attempting to try to understand the concept of war crime. And of course, genocide has always been understood since Lemkin first articulated it as a war crime. And so war crimes as an idea existed before the concept of genocide. And the idea of trying to find a way to regulate the atrocities of conflict is not new. And we can see that, medieval Christians, for example, developed various ideas in order to try to restrict and control war, right? Chivalry, dueling, the concept of defending Christendom, truces on holy days, and things like this were attempts to try to take this, as Lemkin liked to refer to it, the barbarousness, the barbarity, and to put it within certain restrictions. All of them were aiming to create a moral conduct of war. All of these ideas, and we could argue whether or not they were effective in a pre-modern context, that's not really the point here. But all of these ideas of chivalry and dueling and all of that essentially broke down in the rise of modern warfare, and in particular, the atrocities of the Napoleonic Wars, the American Civil War, which shocked Europe and America alike in its cruelty and in its massive scope, and the Crimean War. That these modern wars were technological in a way that hadn't been anticipated before, and the cost of human life was shocking in ways that people were not expecting or prepared for. And after the Napoleonic Wars began a process, an attempt to try and build a new and lasting peace in Europe. This is an attempt that has continued over and over again after every major European war, with the most recent attempt essentially being the European Union. But after the Napoleonic Wars, there was this first attempt to create a new and lasting balance in Europe. So we see the emergence of things like the Geneva Convention, the first Geneva Convention in 1864, and the creation of the International Red Cross, arguably the first modern international non-governmental organization. Then in 1868, we have the St. Petersburg Declaration, which prohibited the use of explosive bullets and small arms. And the 1899, and then it's reformed in 1907 Hague Convention, which was the first time that anyone created the concept of an international law and defined the concept of war crimes. Also, simultaneously creating the first international court, which was the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which was located and still located here in the Hague at the Peace Palace in The Hague in the Netherlands. Also today, home to the International Court of Justice, a later addition to this picture. By the dawn of World War I, there was this hope amongst the groups that had created these treaties and organizations and other things like the Nobel Peace Prize and whatnot, that the neutral powers would be able collectively to exert enough of an influence upon the great imperial powers to balance their aggressions and to prevent the outbreak of another war. So the neutral powers officially declared at that time were Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, Spain, Albania, Switzerland, and the United States. We, of course, know that that didn't really work out, that the outbreak of World War I led to even more shocking technological horrors that really shook all of the preconceptions and the sort of what we can look back as sort of arrogant assumptions about the possibilities of peace in that moment. And so after the war, there was an attempt to do something new and better, and that's the League of Nations. Because neutrality and arbitration spectacularly failed, most notably, neutrality failed directly in the invasion of Belgium, which was a neutral power by Germany in the outbreak of World War I. And there was a direct decision made at the end of World War I not to prosecute the leader of the Imperial Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm. He was removed from power, but he was allowed to live out to the end of his days, essentially in a palace in the Netherlands, if my memory serves me. And none of the leaders of the Central Powers were punished. And instead, the decision was taken to punish the nations involved. And so Germany was punished rather than the Kaiser, right? Austria-Hungary was dismembered rather than the last of the Austrian emperors. And the League of Nations was created. And of course, there was, unfortunately, despite this attempt to try and create a new systems of our international arbitration, what in fact came out of World War I was a recentering the concept of nation. And in the aftermath of World War I, we find that this concept of the nation, of this bloodlines, blood and iron in the name, in the words of sort of German nationalist slogans, that the nation became more important than arbitration, and new sets of atrocities and abominations emerged in the run-up to World War II. The genocide of the Herero and the Makwa people in Southwest Africa, the genocides of the Armenians in the immediate aftermath and during World War I, the horrors of the Belgian Congo, the Japanese crimes in Manchuria, the civil war in Spain, and the actions of Germany against its own people in the days before World War II. And the outbreak of World War II demonstrated quite thoroughly to educated Europeans like Raphael Lemkin that, simply put, what they had done in the past was not sufficient. It was not enough. There needed to be a new framework. There needed to be a new understanding. There needed to be a new way of not just punishing these crimes, but also understanding them for the purpose of preventing them. Because Lemkin understood, as a man with such close and personal encounters with the Holocaust, but also an intellectual understanding of these events, he understood well that the crimes of the Holocaust did not begin at the camps. They began with laws and declarations of the Nazi Party. They began with economic boycotts and stereotyping. They began long before the Nazis even began to take power, that they had already begun paving the roads to Auschwitz and the other camps. And so Lemkin wants both to create a new category for us to be able to punish criminals who commit these crimes. And that's really important, because after World War II, there is never the sort of mass pardoning of leaders again. Instead, what we have is the direct punishment of individual leaders for their crimes in the collective crime of genocide, right? Beginning with the Nuremberg trials after World War II, but also that Lemkin really begins to turn our attention towards prevention of future genocides, not merely the punishment of genocidaires after the fact. For Lemkin, points us to the fact that genocide is a process, right? It's a process of replacement of one people by another people, or of one way of being with another way of being, right? This is why this process of replacing the ways of being is why we can call something like the residential school systems in the United States and Canada, where Native American children were stolen from their people and were made to try to, where had their indigenous cultures and languages beaten and forced out of them, right? To be a genocidal process, because even though, and many of those children died, also the children who did not die, but whose culture and language was stolen from them, are also the victims of a process of replacement by which their peoples were seen as inferior and worthy only of removal. Lemkin tells us that there are many elements to this process. And so he points at, for instance, the political, first off, the removal of political rights, the destruction of political institutions like political parties or pressure groups or political NGOs associated with particular or ethnic groups. He talks about the social. And much of this, he says, is the removal of culture from the public sphere. That much of what the Nazis did early on was not necessarily to prevent Jews from doing the many things that they did, not just religious ceremonies, but also things like the vibrant Yiddish theater companies that existed in Central and Eastern Europe before World War II. They were prohibited from advertising, prohibited from showing their existence. Jewish newspapers were prohibited from appearing in public stands long before they were banned. He talks about this removal of the culture from the public sphere as crucial. He talks about the cultural. He points out that oftentimes the very first people who are targeted for genocidal attack are the intelligentsia, right? The cultural leadership of whatever community it is. Not simply the leaders of organizations, but also people like playwrights and authors, novelists and poets, musicians and conductors, that these people were early targets in order to remove the brightest minds and the greatest analytical capacities from the community, impoverishing the community and making it so that the community more resembles the cultural inferior people that the propaganda describes them as, right? Much of the process of stripping away that Lemkin points us to is a process of trying to degrade the community in question in order so that they come to resemble, in whatever way possible, subhuman individuals that the enemy propaganda describes them as. The economic, the destruction of sources of income, whether those are farm fields or orchards, or the right to practice one's profession. Many well-off Jews in Eastern and Central Europe were doctors and lawyers and other types of professionals. Prevent them from earning their income was seen as a necessary step. The biological, Lemkin points to us that we need to be aware of attempts to prevent reproduction, right? That, for instance, the Nazis made one of the goals of attempting to of creating poor diets for Jews and other targeted communities was to try and decrease the reproductive capacity of Jewish women, right? Because we know that the human body that has difficulty reproducing when it doesn't have enough reservoirs of fat and food supplies on hand. The physical, the denial of food, of course, there's overlap here. the denial of healthcare, as well as things like mass killings. The religious, the destruction of institutions of religious belonging and belief. The moral, the promotion of basic instincts. Um, Lemkin points out, for instance, that the Jewish ghettos of under Nazi Germany were, in their early days, also places where prostitution and other criminal activity was overlooked. And so the idea was to have Jews associated with immoral activities, things that they and their neighbors saw as immoral activities, in order to try to degrade their moral character, degrade the fiber and continuity of the communities at hand. So Lemkin lays this all out in, as I said earlier, surgical detail, in carefully laid out. He step by step he describes how this occurs and how, even in 1944, the extent of the death camp systems was not fully known. Lemkin did not fully understand the full extent of what had happened to his people when he wrote this book, because he could understand the trajectory through seeing how the process evolved over time. And by seeing the trajectory and understanding the character of those involved, he was well aware of what was possible and what was likely occurring in the hidden science landscape of the death camp. So after World War II, we have the emergence and development of the United Nations. And the goal of the United Nations was to learn from the past of the League of Nations and to correct its many flaws. Officially created in 1945 and emerging out of the Allied powers that won the war, it aimed from its get-go to balance both ideals and pragmatism, its founding. And it has at times been good at this balance, and at other times has failed at this balance, if we want to be fair with the organization. But early on, much of its early goals was to attempt to try and create universal standards for not just international law, but for the treatment of individuals and for the guaranteeing of rights. And this was important because one of the legal arguments that was brought up in the Nazi Nuremberg trials was that the Allied power, that this was victor's justice, and that the Allied powers had no right to try Nazi war criminals who were not within their legal jurisdictions. Now, this did not prevent these crimes from being charged, but the lawyers who were involved in the Nuremberg trials were actually troubled by that, being lawyers themselves. And so they wanted that there was a goal in the international legal community to set standards so that if future crimes were to occur, no one could ever claim ignorance again. No one could ever claim that they were simply following the law again. And so the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in its various parts emerges in 1948 to 1949, and based off the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in 1951 emerges the Convention on the Prevention and Prosecution of the Crime of Genocide. And in 1951, they produced this definition. Now, I'm going to spend some time on this definition because this is, according to most international legal bodies, the official definition of genocide. I'm going to talk about how genocide is defined here, but also how this differs from Lemkin's understanding. And of course, Lemkin was alive to see this. And so I'm going to touch each of these parts individually here. So the UN definition of genocide begins with the following lines: any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, religious, or racial group. Now, there's a couple of pieces here. In whole or in part is an important part because it tells us that in a government that eliminates a group of people within its territory, but does not necessarily target a group of people who live outside of its territory, it's still genocidal, right? So an argument, for instance, that the Serb militias that were attempting to annihilate the Bosniaks and Croats from Serb-occupied Bosnia, but we're not targeting Croats in, say, Croatia, we're still committing genocide because they were targeting the portion of that community that lived on their territory. And then this definition of national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Now, ethnical, of course, being an outdated term, but we would replace it with our modern understanding of ethnic. Essentially means, and the way it's been defined by the courts, is that the elimination of social classes, political enemies, specific families or clans does not qualify for the crime of genocide. Though it's important for us to note that it would still count as a war crime, right? That atrocities committed against these other types of folks, especially in the context of war, are still war crimes. They're just not the crime of genocide. In addition, all of those types of crimes would still violate the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which guarantees the right to life for all human beings. The second of our piece of the definition here is killing members of a group. Now, this is what we typically think of as genocide when we discuss genocide, right? But it's important for us to note that this not only includes camps, because actually, since the end of the Nazi regime, most genocidaires don't use camps. They tend to be too redolent of the Nazi example, and most genocidaires in the modern period don't keep good notes and working records in the ways that the Nazis did. So we should not expect that the repetition takes the same form. Instead, most forms of genocide have taken the forms of death squads, or the permitting of non-organized groups such as criminal organization or bandits to kill people with impunity and not to be punished is also fitting underneath this. The second is causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. So this is pretty straightforward, right? That this includes psychological and physical torture. It also includes things like castration or maiming or similar types of attacks upon the body or the mind. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction or whole or in part. Right here, we are talking about more indirect forms. The international courts have found things like the denial of healthcare, planned famine, and mass starvation to all count underneath this. This is one of the reasons why there's a good debatable argument that the Irish potato famine, despite not being planned by the British, was utilized by the British to eliminate what they viewed as a problematic group, the Irish, is likely a case of genocide as well. Then we have imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. So this is another one of those diverse categories. This could include mass sterilization, gang rape, forced abortion, the physical separation of men or women, the prohibition of marriage, and calculated malnutrition, all fit underneath the category of category D here. And then finally, the forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Oh, looks like my colors didn't work there at the bottom. Sorry about that. This has been done through kidnapping and adoption, boarding schools, adoption after mass murder of parents, and enslavement. I once was traveling through Turkey, and I met a man who told me that we were discussing. It's not always wise to talk about the Armenian genocide with Turks, but we were doing it. And I was talking to this fellow about the Armenian genocide, and he said that he believed in the Armenian genocide, but he wanted me to know that there were good Turks in Turkey that tried to do things. And I said, well, could you give me an example? And he said that actually he was the descendant of Armenians, that his great-grandfather, maybe great-great-grandfather, had been an officer on the Armenian front, the Eastern Front, during the genocide, and that he had come across a village that had been annihilated of Armenians and found a little boy and girl who had survived the massacre, and that he had adopted those two children into his household and raised them as Turks. And that this young man said that was an example of how some people resisted genocide. He wasn't too happy to hear that actually his great-grandfather's actions would actually fit directly within Part E of the definition of genocide, because the adoption of children after their parents have been massacred is still a form of the replacement of one way of life with another way of life. Right? So his family was still the product not of the resistance of genocide, but of the participation in genocide. So what does not qualify? So the biggest non-presence in this is political prisoners. And this is an important exception. And it was insisted upon by the Soviet Union in the creation of the definition of genocide. And the Soviet Union insisted that this be the case because they wanted to ensure, the Stalinist government wanted to ensure that their massive, shocking system of Gulag prison camps could never be counted under the definition of genocide. And this is a map of all the various Gulag prison camps. These were horrific places in which millions of people died, but they were targeted in general. There are certainly elements and places within the Soviet Union where genocide did occur, and I'm not trying to make that point otherwise, but it's clear that the majority of the prisoners there were not there specifically because of their ethnicity, but because of some perceived political slight. What also does not count? Acts based upon disability, sexual orientation, social class, or previous condition of servitude. And so, for instance, this is a welcome sign to the international airport in Ghana, and it's highlighting the fact that they state that Ghana does not welcome pedophiles or other sexual deviants. This is essentially the way that the Ghanaian government currently states that they do not welcome gay men into the country. This act, this would not be considered underneath the UN definition to be a genocidal act because sexual orientation is not considered to be, under the law, a counted form of protected category. It does not also include accidental famines, if such thing could exist. Many scholars argue that in this stage it doesn't, or collateral damage that is unplanned. So the definition that the United Nations has is an imperfect one, I would argue. It's one that focuses primarily on the punishment of genocide after the fact. It's one that does not include large categories of atrocity within it, and is one that overlooks the connections between ethnic or religious atrocities and other forms of atrocity. Right? When we examine, for instance, the crimes of the Nazi regime, we need to understand that the crimes against the Jews or the Roma peoples are directly and ideologically tied to crimes against political enemies, against disabled people, against other groups in that way. Gay men and lesbian women. Right, that these other groups were all targeted in a parallel and intertwined processes to the genocide. And so while the United Nations operates under this particular definition, and it has been useful in some cases in understanding and trying certain forms of genocide, Lemkin's legacies do live on in other areas and in other forms of understanding, right? So in particular, so parallel to this legalistic definition that's used in the courts and the treaties, has emerged a field of genocide and mass atrocity prevention studies, a field that I sort of have found myself accidentally thrown into since coming to Cazenovia College, but which I'm proud. I think that it's good work. But at the core of genocide and mass atrocity prevention studies is digging into this central observation of Lemkin's, that genocide is a process that begins long before anyone begins dying. The genocide is a process that begins with political rhetoric, that begins with pseudoscientific theories of race and inferiority, that begins with economic attacks and cultural attacks, and then ramps up as the genocidaires gain power and control. But it's a process that can be stopped.
Thank you. What happened? Oh.
It's a process that can be stopped, and it's a process that can be prevented once it begins. But only if we understand that. And so by naming the process and by creating a broad framework of understanding, Lemkin has begun to inspire generations of later scholars, many folks who have been trying to understand how these similar and other processes, right? Because sometimes we can become blinded by the obviousness of the events of World War II, that we can sometimes miss how processes that occur in other places and other times may take very different forms, but still be genocidal in their character. That Lemkin's frameworks and processual outlook helps us to comprehend both the similarities and the differences, right? And to understand how modern genocide may take a very different form than that of previous generations and previous times, but still be that process of the replacing of one group with another group, that violent annihilation of the national pattern, as Lemkin describes it. A good example, local to us, an organization which does very good work, is Binghamton University's Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Studies, Prevention Studies. IGMAP is what they usually call themselves. And they do a wonderful job of gathering together scholars, gathering together work, and in particular creating this annual Frontiers of Prevention conference. That's me, by the way, in the back row there at the 2019 conference. But that annual event, which brings people from around the world to talk not just about the historical reflections on genocide, but about trying to figure out what current events and what current processes in what parts of the world could become genocidal, right? What begins to move down that process? Where can we prevent? Where can we step in? How can we work to create systems in home countries to prevent genocides from occurring? And actually, the way I view my own work at Cazenovia College, where I work in particular with students who are working at majors like Homeland Security Studies and criminal justice and human services and mental counseling, these would be individuals which would become targeted as participants in any North American genocide. They are the peoples who are always drawn in to become the trigger men and the enforcers of a genocidal project. And so what we need to do in many places is to work to create the systems to prevent these things from ever occurring by working within these professional systems, right? And so I have had a privilege of talking to colleagues in places like Kenya and in Bangladesh about how they're working with their own police forces, their own border control systems, their own healthcare professionals to try and ensure that these things do not occur in their own countries, to prevent them from potentially becoming something in the future. And another organization, which I should mention, and I thought I put them in here, but is the Auschwitz Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, which does good work around the globe in exactly this type of stuff. So hopefully you've come to, I've spoken for about 35 minutes here, so I'm wrapping up, and hopefully you've come to understand a little bit about the legacy, the important legacies and concepts of Raphael Lemkin, and what they can do to help us better understand the processes that occur in our own place, in our own time, and not just convict genocidaires after the fact, but create a system in which there are no future genocidal events. There are no future genocidaires. There are no future need for courts and lawyers and trials. So I look forward to your questions. And if you have any inquiries beyond this, please, my email is here. It's joharasta@cazenovia.edu. And I'm happy to work with folks and to talk about these issues and to really work to try and prevent or to, begin these conversations in our own communities. So thank you very much again to the libraries. And I guess I'll open it up for questions.